And now, it's time for that great new game show.
It's the PowerShell Podcast. It's all about PowerShell and the PowerShell community.
The PowerShell Podcast.
And now, here's your hosts, Jordan Hammond and Andrew Plaw.
Hey everybody, welcome back to PowerShell Podcast. I am the clear reason that everyone is here, Jordan, along with the guy that does 95% of the work for none of the appreciation, Andrew Plaw.
I get some appreciation.
No, they're all here for me. I am delightful. Yeah. You're just a part of it.
You're relatable. You're connectable. Yes.
But
it's not just us, man.
No, honestly, the real reason people are here is for who's the guest, who we talking to. And today we have a legend.
Long overdue.
Jaykul Bennett. This is one where I think a lot of people said, hey, you should interview Jaykul at some point. And I don't know, it's been a long time, but we're glad you're here.
It's been in the works.
Thanks. Yeah. It's one of those. I'm happy to do it.
Happy to have you. We were talking about doing a pre-show this week, and we only had one item, and it's an item that our esteemed guest can contribute to. And so this week, check the show notes. There's a dev.to link from Stephen Morawski, just enough Git for GitOps. And Joel, you were saying that you do quite a bit of GitOps these days.
Yeah, we're moving into Kubernetes, and the more Kubernetes we do, the more GitOps we do. I will say that to a certain extent, GitOps is really just CI/CD in a sense, right? Like the whole idea is that everything happens when you do a check-in. And we are doing that with our infrastructure. We're doing that with our software in Kubernetes. We're doing CI/CD deployments. Now, I will say in our environment, everything's just getting continuously deployed to the dev environment. We aren't in prod yet. But our Kubernetes clusters are all the way to prod, controlled by configuration in Git, and you check it in and it just automatically applies.
Right.
And I have to say, to me, a big part of it is just, it's an adjustment in how you work and in who owns the responsibility of doing the rollback, right? Because you can do a rollback by just reverting a commit.
Right.
And that means that no longer does the developer need to contact me to get his infrastructure rolled back to the previous version. He can just roll back that commit.
Nice. So
it's a big change.
Just to kind of break it down and make sure I'm understanding it correctly. So this is like a CI/CD pipeline sort of, right? So you can imagine a pipeline. On one end, code is committed, and then certain actions can take place until the end when it produces some kind of final
excuse me. In the Kubernetes world, GitOps usually means that there's a secondary controller that runs on the cluster. I guess it doesn't have to run on the cluster. It has to have an agent on the cluster, and usually it just runs on the cluster. But essentially, it's checking Git for new commits. It's watching a branch or several branches or a branch per app or whatever. And when a change is committed, it pulls it down and applies it. And in the case of Kubernetes, it's kind of like anything else that's infrastructure as code. You have a text file like bicep file or a ARM JSON or whatever.
It kind of defines your environment that you need.
Yeah. And in Kubernetes, you're defining everything, right? Network, what software, how many copies, what the health checks are supposed to be, all of the different things. It's all in that file. So this thing, whenever you make a commit, it pulls it down. It does the linting thing to make sure that everything's okay, and then it applies it or tries to. And it is very much like a traditional, CI/CD build system where it triggers when you make your merge to your branch, right? So you can have other branches and it doesn't care. As soon as you put it in the branch that it's watching, let's say main, then boom, everything goes, right?
Yeah.
And we do in ours, we have one big repository with folders for each cluster. So when you check something in to your main app, each of the clusters has a pointer to that, and they all deploy it. But you can check something into a single cluster and just deploy like a dev version of the app or whatever to one cluster.
Cool. And I think that's becoming more and more common as a way for, I guess, companies to do things.
I think it's the only way that you should do something like Kubernetes, because otherwise you're essentially the only other way to work with Kubernetes, right, is you're sending YAML files up and applying them, and then the source of truth ends up being the cluster itself, right? So if you want to know what's supposed to be on the cluster, you don't know. You have to check what's on the cluster, not what's supposed to be on the cluster. So with GitOps, you've got what's supposed to be on the cluster is what's in your Git repository. It gives us DR as well, of course, because it means that I can point another cluster at that same folder in my Git repo, and it'll come up the same way as the first one, right?
Now, when people are trying to learn this, do you think that it's hard, it's complex, or can it be broken down easily? How should people approach learning it? Because I think from what I understand, it might be helpful to understand it conceptually before diving into one particular aspect of it. But what's your opinion?
I think, yes, I think you need to pick it up a little bit at a time, especially because most people who are learning GitOps are also at the same time learning everything there is about Kubernetes, right? Because usually most applications of GitOps are for Kubernetes specifically. When people say GitOps, they almost always mean Kubernetes. They very rarely are talking about legacy stuff. Now, we do basically the same thing with our other infrastructure. We have all these repos that have bicep in them that define resource groups in Azure. We have repos with Terraform in them. And we CI/CD those, following a more traditional CI pipeline with steps that applies it, right? Whereas with GitOps, you're usually using an app that has all those steps hard-coded. You can't change them. You just commit and it happens. So I think it's important to, especially if you're going to, let's say, pick up Argo CD or pick up Flux and apply it into a Kubernetes cluster, you need to know what you're doing in Kubernetes before you do that. But the main concepts of GitOps, I think you can apply anywhere. Well, at least anywhere where you have that infrastructure as code. Because you can do GitOps with pipelines, basically, is what I'm trying to say, or
Right.
workflows or whatever you want to call them. You absolutely can do that same thing. You get that same effect of, hey, when I check it in, it deploys all the things. If I roll back the check-in, it redeploys the old ones, right? There's a little bit of there might be a little bit more work you have to do to make sure that your rollback can clean up, right? So in the bicep world, if you're not doing complete deployments, then if you want to roll back, you have to delete the resource group and redeploy from scratch sometimes. Not often, but sometimes. Because without that complete deploy, your deployment doesn't clean up what was there before. But Bicep does have, or ARM does have, that concept of a complete deployment, where I say this is the full description of everything that should be in the resource group. And if there's anything in the resource group that isn't deployed by this deployment, go ahead and remove it when I'm done. And that's basically how Flux or Argo work on your Kubernetes cluster as well. So
when companies are hiring for GitOps, and I know GitOps is increasing in popularity, like you said, as Kubernetes does, are they, and I imagine people are joining a team with maybe somebody who knows a lot about it, maybe junior, senior, whatever level people, are they hiring for people with a super complete knowledge set, or perhaps they have a background in similar things and have an understanding of some of the steps, or where do you have a good feel for where the industry is in terms of, are we training people a little bit? Where are we with that?
I don't think I have a good feel for where the industry is as a whole. I know it varies a great deal depending on the industry that you're in, and whether you're in a Windows or Linux centric world. Where I am, we are Azure centric and Windows centric. The funny thing is that we've made the decision going into Kubernetes to use Linux containers and not try to continue doing Windows. We'll see how long that lasts, because I think, behind the scenes, I'm prepping my Windows container food. I mean, I think that eventually we're going to get to the point where we're going to say, okay, we want to bring that thing into the containers because it's like the last thing running in that VM or that data center. We got to get it out of there. And we're not going to port it because it's old and nobody remembers who wrote it. But those kinds of things are in our future. I think because of that, we are having trouble hiring because we can't really hire Linux experts that are Kubernetes experts because our pipeline doesn't produce them. It's very hard to find them when you don't have anybody in the interview pipeline that can tell whether they're any good or not. And so we are hiring people who can script. If you can code your way out of a paper bag in Python or PowerShell or I don't actually care what language, as long as you can code your way out of a paper bag in a language and you can talk to me about infrastructure and you know what a subnet is and a VNet is and these kinds of things. The rest of it you can learn on the job. I think I'm probably the only one on my team that's quite that relaxed about the requirement. So you wouldn't like what I just said doesn't really hold true in the hiring process. We have a lot of pieces that we use, VMware and F5s and Azure that we want people to know something about. But we aren't
go ahead.
Sorry. I was just going to say, we aren't trying to find that person that knows all the things. They're very rare. There's not enough of us in the hiring world out there to be able to find somebody that knows, like our tech stack, right, is primarily PowerShell, and Azure DevOps and Kubernetes and YAML and, kubectl and all this automation around Git and all, so there's two conflicting, I guess I would say, not conflicting, but traditionally two different sets of backgrounds that need to come together. And on top of that, like the apps that we deal with, the code that's coming into our cluster is half in .NET and, well, more than half in .NET. It's mostly in .NET and increasingly in Node. And so it's the number of people that know both of those stacks is small as well. And if you throw that in on top of, hey, can you write PowerShell? And do you know Kubernetes? Forget it, right? Those people are in high demand, and we don't really need to hire those people because I can train them. So we just want somebody that knows one of those really well.
Cool.
Can learn.
Seems like an interesting area, and you're solving some fun problems. So I imagine some of our listeners.
That's what keeps me. That's what keeps me happy.
Yeah,
solving fun problems.
It seems like anytime that there's a new, I don't want to say new, but a newer thing, or where different technologies start to merge like this, there's a great opportunity for those that have some grasp on one to jump in early and become the new, like build themselves up to that. So it feels like if you have an interest in any of this stuff, it's a field right now where you can get in early, maybe with a less ideal skill set, and build the skill set and become ultra valuable.
I mean, you guys don't necessarily know my background very well, but I'm a developer. I come from, I learned C#. I I won't tell you what I learned as my first programming language, but I learned dates me too much. But I learned C#. I came into the professional world as a C# developer, and I was a web developer. I was working on web teams, and I was really passionate about automating things. And so when PowerShell came out, I got into PowerShell because it was a scripting language for the .NET framework, which I had learned really well, right? And I was like, this lets me leverage the knowledge I already have in a new place, right? So this is wonderful. And I jumped in on that early on, started blogging about it. That's how I got to be an MVP at Microsoft, was just because I was a technical blogger. Like other people were blogging, hey, getting started with PowerShell, your first hello world, right? And I'm blogging how to call .NET APIs, or how to make a WPF window in PowerShell 1.0 before we could do star threads, right? That kind of nonsense. But the whole process there led me to a job at Splunk, which was DevOps adjacent. But at Splunk, I was a C# or Python programmer. And it was my first job doing Python. I didn't really know Python, but they didn't really care if I knew Python. They knew that I was a programmer and that I knew the automation world, and they were looking for that. And when I left there, I went back to doing WPF C# development for a while. But at some point I had an opportunity where somebody was like, we're trying to transition from on-premise to Azure, and we need people who know a broad array of things. And more importantly, we have this giant library of PowerShell that we need to maintain. And so we need a PowerShell expert. And I remember I called the hiring manager. Well, actually didn't call him. He was on our user group. So I lead the PowerShell online. I call it the PowerShell virtual user group. I don't think that's a catchy term that has caught on. So people call it the PowerShell Slack or the PowerShell Discord, depending on which one they're on. But we have it fully bridged. So there's I don't even know anymore. I can't keep track. 100 channels, let's say, on Slack and on Discord that are bridged across. So they work on both sides. And a couple of those channels cross into other communities. So we have a SQL channel that is actually joined to the SQL Server community. And we have a IRC channel that's joined into Libera Chat, and a couple other things like that that are bridged to other places. So we have a room in there that's open for people to post job listings and whatever. And he had posted it in there, and I had called him, or not called him, but privately messaged him and said, how much is that job offering? And he answered me, and I said, oh, thanks. And I just moved on because it wasn't enough money. And he messaged me back a couple of days later, like, wait, are you asking for yourself? And I said, well, I mean, not if that was the answer, no. And he said, no, but if it's you, we can talk. We can do something different, because if it's you, I can build a team around you. And so I went there, and honestly, this is one of those silly things. I did not realize when I went there, but it turns out that I'm pretty darn good at recruiting. Because when I go out and tell people, hey, I've got openings on my job, there were a bunch of people that wanted to come work with me. So we hired 3 or 4 guys, and we transitioned that company to be an all Azure government cloud certified thing. And that was a lot of fun. So now I'm doing the same thing at another company, trying to help them get into Azure cloud. And of course, this time we're doing it by going into Kubernetes, which is even more fun because I haven't done that before. So I think the big thing, the point of that story is that transition where I just suddenly I got an opening, and I was like, yes, I would love to do DevOps. And I right prior to that, I was a C# developer. And on that job, I think I probably wrote less than 400 lines of PowerShell, C# the whole time I was there. But it was, mostly PowerShell. So it was a language I was already familiar with, but it was all new stuff. But it was the tangent, the very, very close of what I had already been doing. Right. And I think that our industry is constantly in that state of, hey, look at this shiny new thing. Infrastructure as code, right? And you go, well, I don't know anything about infrastructure as code. And I go, well, yeah, but I mean, neither does anybody else. We need 1 million people that know how infrastructure is code, and we have like 10,000. You know what I mean? And I'm obviously we're not at 10,000 anymore, but in those early days, anybody can be an infrastructure as code expert because nobody knows anything. And your manager doesn't know, and his manager doesn't know, and all you need to have is a willingness to learn that thing, and a proficiency for programming in the first place, right? So if you can write code, it doesn't really matter if it's PowerShell or Python or C# or JavaScript. If you can write code and you're interested, then you have that opportunity. And the same thing is happening now with GitOps. The primary language in GitOps is YAML. You really don't need to be much of a programmer to write YAML. I mean, you just have to be able to read the spec, look at the spec and understand what you need to write in the document. That is a skill, but it's not a skill that takes years of experience. It's a skill you can pick up in 2 weeks at summer camp. You know what I mean? And so I think we want, my team, we want to hire people with scripting experience. But I have a couple of people that are C# developers that had never done DevOps before they came to work on this team. And they're honestly very good. And they're some of the best guys on the team because they're technical and detail oriented in a way that some of the guys that come from an IT background aren't. Because they're used to just clicking around a little bit more than the guys that come from the programming background, right? And so we build a team that's a mix of people, and everybody teaches each other, and we all got to be willing to say, I don't know this. Can somebody explain it to me? I think it's important for us to lay that humility thing, right? That to be able to say, I don't know this. Can somebody show me? Because we're all all of us are learning something on this path. And I don't see an end to it personally. Like when I look out and I go, okay, well, Kubernetes, it is clear to me. I don't know about anybody else. Kubernetes is great, but it is not the end of innovation in this thing because it is really, really hard. The whole reason why we're doing Kubernetes as part of our transition into Azure is because there's no way we're going to run Kubernetes on our own hardware, right? It's way too big of a leap for the skill set that we have. And I'm still picking up new concepts every week when I'm working with Kubernetes. The other day we just had one of these moments where I said, okay, you know what, guys? I'm going to go back and I'm going to rewrite our getting started templates that we're giving people for deploying their app the first time, because we've missed the whole concept here that we should have had from day one. And after I rewrite the templates, we're going to have to go through everybody's apps and add this stuff in because we just missed it. And I think that's that's the reality of our world, right? We're always evolving, and Kubernetes is going to evolve. Maybe the next big thing will be Kubernetes 2. Maybe it'll be Docker Compose comes back, right? I'll tell you what, you laugh because I saw you laugh and nobody heard you, but I saw that. I was
no one to know.
2 weeks ago, I took a Friday afternoon and I was just Googling around trying to see what's happening out there in the tech world in my neighborhood, right? And I found a whole bunch of companies that are offering some variation on instant environments in your Kubernetes cluster for development. The idea is basically that you either hand over a Kubernetes cluster or they give you a Kubernetes cluster. And I say give for lots of money, right? But the idea is that your developers can go in and click a button and get an environment, deploy their thing into a pristine dev or prod like environment where they can test their code, right? And most of these have some tie into your CI/CD. So literally every pull request creates a new Kubernetes cluster and deploys this thing. It's not, now you understand, they're not actually creating new Kubernetes clusters. They're creating namespaces in existing clusters. But to the user, to the developer, it appears essentially as a full cluster. They can do whatever they need to do. And they're doing this on the fly, and half of them are using Docker Compose instead of Kubernetes YAML. And the reason is because Docker Compose lends itself really well to, I want to describe 3 or 4 things that all need to be deployed together. They talk to each other. And I don't really care about the details under the covers because that's all been configured already, right? I just want to deploy this app with 3 containers that talk to each other. Docker Compose, the YAML for Docker Compose is a lot smaller than the YAML for Kubernetes to do that, right? And so they're building on top of Compose, and I'm like, okay. And Compose nowadays, Docker Compose can target Kubernetes, so
this seems to me, and this has gone in a conversation I wasn't expecting, but it's fascinating. But one thing that I've picked up from a lot of this is you seem to have a knack for picking up on what technology is going to take off and jumping in on that. And I guess my question is, I don't know if it's subconscious or if you're aware of it, but what are you looking for when you decide this is where I'm going to make the next leap because it's going to become something?
That's a good question. I think I can honestly say that I have it on my I have on my resume that I'm a challenge-driven developer. And what I mean by that is the thing that will keep me interested and the reason why I'm still here at this company where I am right now. I think I'm allowed to mention them. I'm working at Loan Depot right now. We're not doing that great right now because we're a mortgage company, and the mortgage industry right now is kind of a shambles. Because interest rates have gone up, and Loan Depot in particular was focused for a long time on refinancing mortgages. So we were killing it back when interest rates were 0 point something. So we're pivoting. We're doing home equity lines of credit. We're doing a whole bunch of other stuff. And I try not to worry about the business side of things because it's just not. I'm not interested, if I'm perfectly honest. I'm much more interested in the technology side of things, and the place where business and technology intersect for me at the level where I'm willing to work. Because I'm always one of the things that I have done repeatedly through my career is avoid getting promoted to be a manager. So one of the reasons why I pivot is when I reach that point where I can't not be a manager, I find something else to do.
Have you considered showing less value, and then they'll just keep you there anyway?
I love teaching, and I love being like that senior lead on a team where I'm mentoring people. But I don't want to be the guy that has to make the decision to lay people off, and I don't want to spend all my day in meetings. And my bosses spend the vast majority of their time, meeting with other bosses, talking about what they're going to do and not actually doing it. And so that's where I'm like, no, I don't want to do that. But as far as like where I go, it's about that challenge. It's about looking for something interesting that I feel like, hey, I want to know how to do that. So it is very much not, what was the word that you used? It's very much not intentional. I'm not evaluating with that in mind. It's something that catches my eye, and I go, "That's interesting." That first pivot where I stopped, being a developer and became a DevOps engineer. I'll tell you the truth. When I hired on at which is, by the way, the name of the company, not like a stand-in for me not telling you. When I hired on at they had to promise me that after we migrated everything to Azure, that I could have a job on their web development team. Because I was like, I'm going to do this thing, and then I don't want to do, build engineer. I did that like a long time ago in my career, and DevOps is frequently code for build engineer. I don't want to do that. I want to be a developer, and I want interesting problems to solve, not the build failed, right? So they did. They promised me that. Of course, then they outsourced that whole department to India, but that's a whole nother conversation. But that was part of I was afraid, right? Like I was like, I don't know if I really want to do DevOps. I need an out. And I don't worry about that kind of stuff anymore, because I found, for myself at least, that if I'm willing to pivot, I can always, if I'm willing to do the work that needs to be done, I can always find a job.
So you follow opportunity and just trust in yourself to be able to do it.
Yeah.
That's gotta be nice to have that kind of confidence.
I tell you what, I wish that I could teach it, but I do have that. I don't have to think about that. I don't worry about it. Now, obviously, part of that is just earned, right? I've been doing this thing for decades now. I can say decades now.
You don't be
that's on the end, right?
A 15-time MVP.
I am a 15-time MVP, and I have enough experience to say, yeah, it won't be a problem. Do I need to learn something new? Fine, no big deal. Just as long as you're okay letting me learn that on the job, then we'll be fine.
So it's got to be pretty important for you to get a feel during an interview that they're going to give you the leeway to learn the new thing then.
Yes, it is.
Going in having to learn with no grace period seems like
I will say I explicitly look the thing that will turn me off of your company faster than anything else is if I say, by the way, I'm a Microsoft MVP. I go to the MVP conference every year. That means I need a week to go to that. And I speak at the PowerShell Summit every year. I need a week to go to that. And I would like to go to a conference to learn. So that's going to be 3 weeks that are not my vacation, right? And if you're okay with that, that is all I need to understand how you value learning, right? And how you value personal development, because those are the key things, right? For me, if you're okay with that, I don't necessarily, now what I really want to hear you say is, oh yeah, we pay for 2 conferences every year, right? That's what I really want to hear you say. As the manager, yeah, absolutely. We pay for we send everybody to a conference every year, right? Or oh no, not in addition to that, you're going to have to fly out to our corporate headquarters twice a year. Fine, great. But because I only work remote anymore, I think despite having been full remote for a long time now, I really value the investment that the company makes to say we want everybody to come together a couple times a year, meet each other, have some team building time, and have some planning time where we pulled you out of work and we had you do this networking and planning and team building. I think it's super valuable for teams to see each other, to meet each other face to face. My last job, I actually never met anybody face to face except when I coincidentally went to Ignite and met my boss at Ignite, because he and I both went to the conference. But that was like, I'd been working there for I don't know, a couple of years at that point when I met him. And I'm okay with that, right? But it's so much nicer when you have that. Oh yeah, once a year we're gonna ask everybody to fly out to somewhere, and at Splunk they would make it different places every year. It's like, oh, we're going to Napa Valley, we're going to Denver, we're going to whatever. But we would have that time, and in fact, they had a commitment for every team to get together once a year or twice a year rather. And then they had a hackathon for the development org, which included the DevOps org or the sales tech. Cause I was actually a developer in the sales org at that time, to come together and do this hackathon, which was part of the purpose of that was to have all developers spread out and work with other developers on other teams so that you get to know people that you are interacting with, but not working with on a team, so that you have less, ideally, so that when you need help from that other team, you have somebody you can call that knows you and recognizes you as not some lazy guy that's trying to pawn work off on me, right? But another professional that I respect because I worked with them on the hackathon project.
Yeah, we do that where we work once a year. The whole company comes to headquarters and they plan stuff. And it is very helpful to have those in-person relationships with people on your team, but also across teams where, like you said, they feel comfortable reaching out to you because they know you're approachable. They know you're interested in actually solving problems and so on and so forth. To your point about learning and jobs letting you do that, it's like, do you want to work for an org that doesn't empower you to do your job? Or do you want to work for an org? Because people can say whatever they want, but unless they're putting budget behind it, is that really their values?
It's funny. I expect it.
Yeah.
I don't know. My very first job ever in tech, because I worked in factory jobs during high school and college, but whatever. But when my very first job after college, I got married. I got married a year after I graduated. I got married. But that I spent that intermediate year doing volunteer work out in the Channel Islands and England. Anyway, but that my very first professional job, so to speak, was at Xerox, and at the time, Xerox was Fortune 100 big behemoth of a company, but they had an expectation of we pay people. I got into what they called the Technician Opportunity Program, which was for people who did not have a relevant bachelor's degree. Because I had a bachelor's degree in youth ministry and cross-cultural studies at the time. It's the whole story, but they put me through a bachelor's degree in computer science because I had started doing programming work. I was there doing the programming, but I didn't have the computer science background, and I felt like it would be helpful. But they paid for that. They gave me time off work, and they paid for it all. And then when I finished that, I did a master's degree on that. Now they had some caveats, right? Like, you finish a master's degree, you owe us 2 more years of work. Like, you can't leave the company, or you're going to have to pay the money back. Which was fine. I was ready to make that trade at that point. But having that shows a willingness to invest in your people, right? And it built a lot of what's the word?
Trust.
Well, I was very committed to the company. I stayed at Xerox at least 5 years longer than I should have stayed at Xerox. In the sense that I was not getting paid what I was worth for at least 5 years while I was at Xerox. And that wasn't because I owed Xerox that time, because I had worked that time already. It was because I liked the company and I liked the people that I worked with. And even though I could see that the stock was going down and that we were outsourcing our work, we were desperate. The company was trying to pivot from, hey, we make printers and copiers, to anything that might be relevant in a world where nobody cares about putting things on paper. because I can email it to you, right? And so they were definitely flailing a bit, and my teammates were leaving, right? I was watching people go. But I was loyal to the company, not out of some sense that they were going to succeed, but out of some sense of obligation, because they were good to me and I wanted to be good to them, that kind of thing. I feel that, like, to a lesser degree, I think I've learned a little bit my lesson at Xerox about sticking around too long. But I feel that to a lesser degree anywhere where the company is willing to invest in their people, because I feel like if you're willing to invest in me, then I'm willing to take a chance on you and give you a little bit more effort, a little bit more of a chance to turn things around than I would otherwise. It's an interesting thing. I've worked a couple places where they don't do that. And I didn't last long there. So it's an interesting, like even subconscious trade-off, if you will.
Yeah. And it definitely, if you're hiring smart people, you're going to want people who want to learn. And if you're hiring that type of person, you got to empower them. And then they'll, like you said, be loyal. They'll do more work. They'll be more invested. So I think smart leaders see that hopefully more and more as we, as tech professionals, kind of grow and improve. Hopefully, freaking leadership, the people with the budgets, learn as well and have that kind of modern perspective on approaching your job. But I wanted to take a moment to highlight some of your favorite PowerShell talks, because you've been a long time MVP, right? You've given some great talks over the years. Are there any in particular that stand out to you as interesting or worth sharing? Because I know there's a bunch of them.
Gosh, I don't know. I think it's funny. The very first thing that I produced that had staying power is now probably almost impossible to find on the internet, because there's a blog post that I wrote about error handling in PowerShell and how there's so many different modes, right? You got exceptions and you got errors and you got like standard error output. And that was on my blog, and I don't think you can find that anymore because my blog went away and came back, and the content's mostly only available on archive.org. But I gave a talk last year at the PowerShell Summit about invoke build. And I have to say, for the record, that I had a huge bias against invoke build when I first started using it, because I didn't like how it was written. And the one of the things that hit me after playing with that for a while was that it was that what I didn't like about it was primarily that it was written in PowerShell 1, and it shows, right? Because there's style choices and decisions that were made that have been
Outdated.
Like for example, you can install it as a module from the PowerShell gallery now, but when you install it, if you do git command, the command that comes out of it is invoke build, and that invoke build is not a command that the module exports. It's an alias that points at a script, because actually invoke build is not a module; it's a script. And
weird.
Yeah, it's very weird. And if you are like me, where you look at things and judge them based on how they're implemented, sometimes I kind of went, "What? This is gross." But I I was just last Friday I was trying to do something at work, and I said, I need something to convert this text from the space delimited nonsense to comma separated. And I went, I have a script for that. Import delimiter or convert delimiter. Where is that thing? And I went looking. Of course, it's a script I wrote back when poshcode.org was a script repo, because PowerShell Gallery didn't exist. And and I found it in my Git repo on Poshcode. I have two. I've mixed identity on GitHub. I have a Poshcode org, and I have Jaykul, my personal account. But for some reason, I sometimes post things in the Poshcode one instead of in Jaykul. I always have a reason for that, but it's not important. The old Poshcode site is on that Poshcode org, and it has all the scripts are there. And it actually renders, if you go to poshcode.org/scripts, the site, the things are all there, but I've discovered that Google doesn't know they're there. So I didn't realize that until just recently, but they've disappeared off of the search engine. So you can't find them anymore. I need to, like, point some links at them or something. But that script, I went and looked at it and I was like, oh my goodness, this thing is written like PowerShell 1.0 style, with no param block, handles mandatory parameters by throwing an exception, that kind of thing. And that is the influence that I see. I'm not saying it's all that old, because invoke build has been maintained, but the key is that invoke build was written back then, and it has been maintained with the intent of keeping backwards compatibility. So it works very well all the way back to who knows how far back. And not only that, but because the developer for invoke build is a developer, and he's using invoke build to build his code projects. So there's an ib.cmd, right? And an ib.sh. You can run this thing in your DOS, right? Or in Bash, and invoke build, and it runs PowerShell and starts itself, that kind of thing. And the decision to not be a module is so that when you build multiple, if you build one module and then you build another module, the separation, because it's a script, no variables get carried over from one invocation to another. So you can do whatever you want to do. You can pollute his namespace or whatever, and it doesn't affect your ability to do another build. So there's reasons, right? This is what I'm getting at. There's reasons why it's done the way it is, and it's a great tool. I did a whole talk. I probably didn't spend this much time explaining why I think that the design choices are there, but I did a talk about how to use it at the PowerShell Summit last year. I think that's a good talk.
I think it lends itself well to your tempting fate patterns and practices for shareable scripts and functions, because it sounds like there could be a little bit more of that.
That talk I've given twice. I gave it last year in an attempt to, what's the right word? Well, and it was called Tempting Fate last year because I last gave it before COVID. And in that, when I gave it at that year, it was just called, what was it called? Patterns and Practices for Building Survivable PowerShell Scripts or something. Survivable being the key word, because the bulletproofing, that's what it was called.
That's right.
Bulletproofing. So of course I walked on stage early, set up my laptop, and my laptop showed like 9 external monitors when I plugged in the projector. And none of them were the projector. And the long story short is I actually ended up borrowing somebody's laptop, which was possessed, I swear. And he had, now all of these are things that I found out while I was giving him my talk, right? But he had his VS Code using some kind of settings sync from his desktop, and it was set so that the laptop was slave to the desktop. So when you change settings, it would change back. And my whole talk had been built around the idea that I had this extension in VS Code that did slides. Because they were all written in Markdown, and I was just going to show them in a side panel in VS Code, and then be able to toggle back and forth between code and the slides. And that all just went, it went bad in so many ways. It was just ridiculous. I did still do my talk. I think I probably started 10 minutes late because of, fighting technical issues. I shouldn't say that. I didn't start 10 minutes late, but I got to content 10 minutes late because of fighting technical issues. Because I was there doing the whole okay, guys, so we're gonna try this, and hi, my name is, and this kind of stuff while I'm fighting the laptop. So that was crazy and frustrating, and so I thought I would do it again. But that talk, obviously one of my passions when it comes to PowerShell is that we as a community should all write the best that we can write, and that we should as a community make that we should all agree on, hey, this is the best way to do it, or these are good ways to do it. Maybe we can't agree on what the best way is, but these are good ways to do it, and that we should be prolific as a community at telling other people that are new, oh, don't do it that way. There's a better way. Wrap your code in a try catch, and don't write functions. Write a module. Don't write scripts. Write a module. And these little things you can write scripts. Absolutely. At work, we have a repo full of scripts, and I tell everybody on the team, look, this is where you put things when it's like a brainstorm, or you wrote it to solve a problem while you were on call. Put it in there, and then put a ticket in the backlog to get that thing moved into a module and write tests for it so that we know that it works and that it stays working going forward. Because otherwise, this thing just becomes like the lost land, the land of lost toys, right? Like all these things out there, and some of them work and some of them don't, but nobody knows which ones work. And so it's like there might be gems in there, but we're too scared to use them, right? And so there's a whole bunch of patterns and practices. I took over in the poshcode.org. There's a book called Patterns and Practices, blah blah blah. I should probably know the name of it.
I'll give a link to it.
But I actually took that over from Don Jones, and I work on it lightly now and then, and we have a discussion board associated with it where we talk about, we do stuff like have a poll about how do we want to do white space formatting in the PowerShell community. Do people like OTBS or KNR, or what's the right? Do we put our braces on a new line or at the end of the line? That kind of nonsense.
So as I say, I know OTBS has the one true brace system.
One true brace. Yeah.
I have not heard the other one. What's that?
KNR is Colonel and Richie. That's not right. I can't remember his name. Anyway, they were the guys that wrote the seminal book on C++, or C even. Yeah. And they, in their book, they basically, they with the hubris of people who write books, said this is the way that you should format your code. But more importantly, they said this is the way that code in the book will be formatted, and they spelled it out very clearly. And they basically laid out the rules for how they would format code, and it became a standard. And in fact, the one true brace, OTBS, as we call it, that actually is a modification of theirs. And it's around that question of whether you put the brace on the end of the line or on a new line. And it's mostly because in the kernel, what is his name? In the Richie book, they had you put braces in different places depending on the context. So if you're starting a class, it needs to go on the next line. But if it's at the end of an if, then you put it on the end of the line, that kind of thing. And the one true brace system is basically, look, let's just simplify this. Always put the brace on the end, or if it's the closing brace and you're writing like an if else, it goes on the same line as the else. We don't waste a line to put a brace on it. That's the rule. Now it's much simpler. You don't have to be like, well, if it's in this situation, you put it on a new line. If it's in this situation, you put it on the same line, right? We just one true brace. It's always on the same line. And one true brace won in the PowerShell community because in PowerShell 1.0, you couldn't put a brace on a line by itself if you were typing in the console. So if you were typing in the console and you put an if, parentheses, blah, 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 parentheses, enter, it would run and say, sorry, that's not valid. But if you put the brace, the open brace on the end of the line, when you hit enter, it would prompt you for, hey, what goes in between these braces, right? And so if you wanted to be able to write the code in the terminal, or if you wanted to be able to copy paste it from your editor into a terminal, because back then we didn't have any integrated editors that worked with PowerShell, right? So you were always writing in like Notepad++ and pasting it into the shell to make sure it worked. So that was the reality. I think because of that, we adopted this style, and the majority of PowerShell code is formatted that way. And I tell people this is the way that write OTBS. Now, if you want to write it some other way, fine. Make sure you document that in your repo or your, team handbook or your company coding guidelines or whatever, and follow it so that it's consistent through all of your code. But as a general rule in the PowerShell community, we do it this way. Now, there are a bunch of people that do Straustrup. Straustrup's another programmer from back in the day who wrote a book, and he didn't like what he called cuddled else's. So it's that thing where you put the else, you're writing an if else, and you put the curly braces on either side of the else. He didn't like that. So that was the one place where he would break from the OTBS, was he would put, if he was writing an if else, he'd start the else on a new line. So close brace and then the word else with a curly brace on the end of the else, so that it was a more visible separate statement. The else was right up against against the left margin. But it's silly, right? Like fighting about that is silly. The key thing is make a decision. And in the modern era, the key thing is make a decision and put it in your config for VS Code.
The .VS Code folder.
And hit that format button and let it format it according to the rules that we all agreed to, right? Yeah, it's great.
So if you're using the default one for VS Code with PowerShell, it's going to default to the one true brace system then?
I think so, because I think they made that was one of those things like early in the day when we were doing this book. We had a very long thread. Hundreds of people voted for their favorite bracing system. And then when the PS Script Analyzer was revising rules and they made this thing where you could put in different, they put in 2 or 3 different bracing systems. They picked that one as the default because they said, well, Joel's PowerShell and Practice book said, there was a community vote and we all agreed that this is the way, so we're going to do that. And I believe, I could be wrong, I believe that the guy that was managing that project at the time didn't actually prefer that one, but he went with the vote because it was justifiable, right? And that's what I tell people. A big reason for having the book and having it all out there and having I leave issues open, and those discussions, I leave those open. And part of the reason is because I want them to be findable, because I want people to see, look, we had this argument 10 years ago. And we all agreed that this is the way it was going to be done. This wasn't something that Joel just wrote this and said, here's how to do it. Right. None of the stuff in here is what I just made up. It was Don Jones first, and then I've continued that. We were just documenting what the majority opinion was, right? At least that's what we're trying to do. Yep.
Well, I have enjoyed this conversation very much, but it's time to pivot to the most dreaded 3 questions you'll ever get asked. Are you ready?
No, but go ahead.
All right, these are the common parameters. We ask these for every guest, and they're near impossible. No one's ever prepped. So
I have not prepped.
Yeah. All right. Well, then, I mean, we'll see how adaptable you really are right now. Right. Question 1: what is one time something went wrong while on the job, and what did you learn from it?
That's a good one. I think we had a situation recently at work where we had some teams deploy unintentional. That GitOps thing bit us, basically. A team didn't understand what they were doing. One of the development teams didn't understand the implications of what they were doing. And they were trying to deploy one microservice, and they deployed all 5 of them instead to production, of course, because nobody noticed before it got to production. And so one of the things that I learned from that was that we need to document our assumptions. And I think that's true across the board. I've learned this lesson before. You need to say upfront to everybody. And one of the things that we know on my team is that documentation is never good enough. And that's not because you can't write good enough documentation, but it's because no matter how much effort you put into documentation, somebody's going to come along and not read it. So we try to back up documentation with reminders and, these kinds of like pivot moments where I force you to acknowledge that you read the documentation, even though you maybe didn't, that kind of stuff. But the bottom line is we need to be explicit about saying, hey, this folder, when you say publish, we're publishing the whole folder, not just the one app. And that version number, because what happened in their case was there's a place in the YAML where they are supposed to set which version of the component should be deployed, right? Which version of their container should be deployed. And they just put the one component that they wanted to deploy in that spot. They didn't put the other 4 or 5 rather. So they thought, no big deal, we're just deploying this one. But in reality, what happens is we use the default. So latest. So we just deploy latest if you don't tell us which version. And that was because when we were doing the work originally, it didn't occur to us that somebody would put a bunch of stuff in and only want to deploy one, right? Just wasn't an assumption. It was an assumption that we made that you'd deploy one thing and then you'd come and add another thing and then you'd come and add another thing, right? And that just turned out not to be the case. That's just not how developers were doing it. They were working on 5 things at once and they wanted to release the first one when it was ready and the rest of them were not ready. And so we had to revert that and actually, to be honest, we had to come up on the spot in the release meeting. I had to explain to them, okay, here's a way that you can do what you're trying to do without just deleting everything from the YAML and starting over with just one app in it, right? So I think the big thing for me that I learned there is don't just assume that we all have the same assumptions, right? If you think it's obvious, you still need to write it down, and not just write it down. Make sure that you tell people that when they're onboarding, but make sure that you tell your team that when they hire somebody new, that person needs to know, et cetera, right? Because we're just having it in the README has never been enough.
All right, that's a good takeaway. And I like the bit about documentation just because I mean, as someone who's terrible at even doing the basics, it's never good enough anyway. But I like to hear that even those that put in the work, it's still not good enough.
Yeah, and that's one of the reasons we tell people, right? Like, what's his John Snover used to have a saying about documentation. Trying to remember the exact, because I'm going to horribly misquote him but it was something like documentation is like sex. When it's bad, it's good. Even when it's bad, there was more to it than that. But the point is that even when it's bad, it's better than nothing, right? And that is totally the key thing. Like, you have to write it, because even when it's bad, it's better than not having it. Anyway, yeah.
All right.
What's your other question?
Question 1 out of the way. Question 2, it only gets more difficult from here. With everything that you know now, what's one tip you would give your younger self when you're first starting out?
Be less afraid to move jobs. And I guess I might even say that as be looking even when you're not looking. Keep an eye out, because the key thing about it is that your value increases constantly, right? And we forget that, and as you are learning, your value is increasing. Be prepared to either force that issue at your current employer or look somewhere else, because otherwise you're just going to get stuck like I did for a long time in a job where you're not getting paid what you should have been. When I left my first job, I got a 80% pay raise and 100% bonus, signing bonus for I got a year's salary.
Let's go.
And that was just the first time that I ever thought, hey, I should go look outside of my company. And that was the first job that I ever took, leaving one company to go to a new job. But it was because I just didn't know, right? I had no idea that I was worth that on the open market, if you will.
Yeah, it's a great first experience, though.
It was. Yeah.
All right. Well, last question. This one, I mean, no one's ever ready for this one. What are your 3 favorite modules? You can use your own.
I was gonna say, it's funny. The way that I ought to answer that is I ought to say, what's imported when I launch a new terminal? And of course, there's not just 3, so that makes it harder. It's cheating a little bit to say PS read line.
I disagree.
That's not mine, but it's kind of built in. So but if you are just using PowerShell and you don't know what PS readline is, oh my goodness, please get command dash module PS readline, and then read all the help for all the commands in PS readline, because you can customize your environment so much. Hotkeys, I recently posted a short GIF. And actually, I'm thinking about it. I don't think I ever posted that on the site that was formerly known as Twitter. I think I only put it on Mastodon. But there's a project that Microsoft made a long time ago called Codex CLI, and I have forked it and called it Readline AI. But it's nothing, right? I wrote like 2 lines of code and made the and copied somebody else's pull request, because Codex is abandoned and somebody else fixed it, and I pulled their thing in and wrote a couple lines. But it's basically a hook into the PS read line so that you can type a comment and then hit a hotkey, and it goes and calls ChatGPT, and ChatGPT writes the code that should have gone under the comment, right?
You did that just like 10 days ago. You're going recent.
It's but the point is that PS readline is what enabled that, right? So you can just set a hotkey and say, I want to run this little block of script on the code that's in the terminal that I've already typed, and it writes more code in the terminal where you were typing, and poof, right? That thing is super powerful and you can do so much with it. I think my other two favorite modules right now are going to be my configuration module, which is a way to give your module settings. So if you have a module, hey, PS Readline author, if you have a module that ought to have, in the case of PS Readline, ought to have a configuration file where it saves what people want their configuration to be. All you do with configuration module is you import it, or you make it a required module for your module, and you type import configuration somewhere in one of your commands, and it will import basically there's an export configuration and an import configuration, and both of them detect the module they're running from, figure out where on the computer the file should be saved. Basically, it goes in your app data or your .config local if you're on Linux. And it saves a file configuration.psd1. And it's paired with another module called metadata that does serialization to PSD1 format. So people can, or module authors, I guess I should say, can export any object that they have, or like a hash table or any object that they have their settings for the module in. You can just serialize it to disk and then deserialize it when you start up again. It's a really easy way to give your module settings. And was that my third? I kind of cheated and got metadata in there, but I think that's the second one I mentioned. So the third one's going to be easy theme, which you have to try and Basically, easy theme is another one that I wrote, and it takes configuration and makes it apply to modules that didn't bother doing their own configuration. So you can write. There is a module out there now. These ones are in pre-release on the PowerShell gallery, so you can find them, but to install them, you'll have to do the allow pre-release. But there is a theme.psReadline out there and a theme.psStyle out there. And those two modules that I wrote are just really, really thin wrappers around psStyle and psReadline to change the colors on them, right? So you can, from the easy theme module, you can write a wrapper around whatever you want. I mostly play with colors because I'm really into the ANSI escape sequences and making my colors be the way that I want them to be. But easy theme gives you a way to wrap really anything that you can do in a script, and it let you write a pair of commands like get whatever theme and set whatever theme, and it will serialize the results of that. So when you say export theme, what it actually does, easy theme, right? That you write a module, and in that module you put in your private data an annotation that says I support easy theme, and this is the command you call for get, and this is the command you call for set in my module, right? So you can see that in example. I wrote a theme.psReadline. That's an add-on for the psReadline module that just has a get psReadline theme and a set psReadline. Okay, and it sets the colors that psReadline uses for code highlighting. You know that when you're typing in the PowerShell terminal, psReadline actually does syntax colorizing, right? So those colors are settable in the psReadline command, but they're complicated, and it doesn't save them. So if you set them, you have to put them in your profile or something, right? So theme.psReadline lets you set them all and then do export theme, and it saves it with a name. So you say export theme Joel, right? And now my settings are stored. And then when it comes back, I can do import theme Joel, and it imports. And in fact, what actually happens is that when you import easy theme, it looks at all your modules and sees, do any of them support easy theme? And if so, have I imported a theme? And if so, let me send the settings from that theme to the modules that are already loaded. And vice versa, if you import a theme psReadline, for example, after you've imported a theme with easy theme.psReadline will go to Easy Theme and say, hey, what theme is running? And it'll call it and set the settings. So it's like a bidirectional thing. But the key thing is that if you use, I've actually got on my computer, I've got theme PowerShell, theme psReadline, theme psStyle, and theme Windows Terminal. And those 4 all work with Easy Theme to color different parts of what I'm working on, right? So I have a theme saved that has matching colors for the default 16 colors that are in psReadline, or I mean in psStyle, and then code for the psReadline and PowerShell.
So
and then
you have
also does the color scheme for Windows Terminal.
I was wondering, could you have just like an alternate theme that like shows well for presenting? So if you're giving a speech,
Yes, exactly why I wrote it. Yep.
Okay.
Yep.
Okay.
So the idea is that you can have multiple themes and you can switch between them. In my profile, I detect if the terminal's elevated and I import a different theme when the profile's running elevated, so that I get a different. Now I have, over the years, I've changed that. It used to be that my elevated theme was inverted, right? So it was like a red background. Then I started using a white background with black text for elevated. Nowadays, I just change the prompt so that I can tell from looking at the prompt, because I don't like that white background anymore. It's too bright. Can't deal with it. So, but yes, you can have multiple themes and you can switch between them. In point of fact, the theme, let me think, theme.psReadline has a function in it for exporting importing. I guess I'm not sure now that I say that out loud. I can't remember which way I wrote the verb there, but basically for taking the syntax highlighting theme that you're using in VS Code and applying it to psReadline, so that you can copy your colors out of your VS Code theme and put them in psReadline, so that psReadline syntax will get highlighted the same colors as you use in VS Code. And the theme.psStyle or theme.Windows Terminal, one of those has a command for pulling in iTerm2 themes. So you can do a get iTerm2 theme, and there's like, I don't even know how many 100 or whatever themes there that are color schemes for the terminal, for the like those base 16 colors that the Windows Terminal stores. And you can literally run that from theme Windows Terminal, and copy those themes into Windows Terminal so that they're named themes in your Windows Terminal. But you can also obviously apply them to your computer, and you can switch. I mean, if you were that sort of person, and I am not, but I tried it for a few days just to prove that it could be done. You can get a random theme every morning, apply it to your Windows terminal. Anyway,
Mix things up a little bit.
Well, I'm not sure if you're aware of this, but you've actually been speaking to a major celebrity whose excellence shines so bright it's been known to short out people's web cameras if they're on the same call as him. And his excellence is focused around none other than shilling PowerShell related podcasts. But you have a front row seat to watch the world expert on podcast shilling spin his magic. Take it away, Andrew.
Jordan, thank you so much. Beloved listeners, thank you for another fantastic PowerShell and knowledge-filled episode. Hit us up with a like, comment, subscribe, give us a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts or your podcast platform of choice. They can listen to us anywhere, Jordan. They can even watch us on YouTube. That's amazing. You can join us. Oh, wait. You can actually email us first. PowerShell@pdq.com. That goes to Jordan and I. You got feedback, things we should cover, awesome projects that you've seen. If you're on Discord, check out the PowerShell official Discord. There are some links below. There's also the Slack. And like Joel mentioned, there's also a way to tap in through IRC. If you want some more of Jordan and I, we're on the PDQ Discord regularly. There's a PowerShell channel. There'll be a link to that. If you want to find us across the interwebs and see what else we're up to, I'm Andrew Plotek. He is DevOps Jordan. And Joel, thank you so much for joining us. Where can we find you?
It's a pleasure. I'm Jaykul, pretty much everywhere. Jaykul on Twitter. On Mastodon, I'm at Fostodon, which is the FOSS Tadon. But I'm also Jaykul on LinkedIn and Facebook. And I don't do tech stuff. I don't use LinkedIn really at all. I do it for, when I'm looking for work, but other than that, I really don't use it.
Awesome.
But yeah.
Cool.
If you find a Jaykul, it's probably me.
Links in the show notes to all your stuff, ways to connect with you. It'll all be there. Jordan, another award-winning episode. Joel, thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks for joining the PowerShell Podcast with your hosts, Jordan Hammond and Andrew Plaw.
They're serious. They mean what they're saying.
The PowerShell Podcast is a production of PDQ.com.